We have our first speaker, Professor Tony. Please come forward and address us. And I'm looking forward to his speech because he has some 20 years management experience on doing global health, promoting health and advising governments on all sorts of public health matters. Yeah, Professor, please.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks very much for that introduction, and it's terrific to be with you here today. So, as you can see from the title of the talk, what I was hoping to do in the next probably 25 minutes is to connect the opportunity for the International Academy to what's happening at the global level, the so-called post-2015 development agenda and the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think there's a particular opportunity here for colleagues in the room. So let me just get myself a bit organised up here. So I've got my little stuff in place. So in the talk, I'd just like to speak very briefly about what UN University is, because not everybody knows what we are. Speak briefly about the global urban transition, make some specific points about climate change and health, and importantly, the positive story around that, the idea of co-benefits for health from the transitions we need to make to live in sustainable ways, post-2015 and the SDGs, of course, and then, if there's time, the value of systems thinking and this idea of a new way of conceptualising health beyond what we currently call global health to planetary health. This guy is really important from the point of view of UN University, U Thant, who was the third Secretary General of the United Nations in post during the 1960s. He was from Burma, and by the time he finished his term, he was concerned that decision-making about global issues was way too politicised, and he thought that if there was a university for the United Nations, it could help bring ideas from academia and beyond into the UN system to build knowledge and capacity for decision-making. And so that's why we exist, and the institute that I direct, that happens to be based in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, because the government of Malaysia endowed funding to establish our institute. We're the institute that focuses on health, and we look at it from this global perspective. Now, to begin my talk, I'd just like to show a 3-minute video about the idea of the Anthropocene, this new geological epoch that we are now considered to be within, and the anthropo meaning that man is the era of man in terms of we are now changing the Earth's systems. So let's spend 3 minutes just looking at this conceptually. In this YouTube video, I'm told I can just touch the screen in this high-tech world.
This is the story of how one species...
Oh, I've touched the wrong one. Let me go back.
...changed a planet. The latest chapter of our story begins in England 250
why is
years
it
ago.
showing here, but it's not showing
Fueled
there?
by coal, then oil, several brilliant inventions appeared. They ignited the Industrial Revolution, which spread like wildfire through Europe, North America, Japan, then elsewhere. The great railways, then cars and highways, connected people across the globe. Medical discoveries saved millions of lives. New artificial fertilizers meant we could feed more people. Population rose rapidly. But this was nothing compared
Is there
with
anything we
what
can
was
do
to
about
come.
that, or should we
The
just stop?
1950s marked the beginning of the Great Acceleration. Globalization, marketing, tourism, and huge investments helped fuel enormous growth, which became even more powerful engines of creativity. In a single lifetime, improved beyond measure.
Yeah, I think
Health,
maybe we should
wealth,
just stop.
security,
and,
longevity.
we,
Never have so many had so much. Yet 1 billion are malnourished.
Do you want to listen to
In a
the
single
words, or should we
lifetime,
just
we have
stop
grown
this?
into a phenomenal global force.
I think it might be best to just stop it.
We move more sediment and rock annually than all natural processes, such as erosion and rivers. We manage 3/4 of all land outside the ice sheets in England 250 years ago. Fueled by coal, then oil, several brilliant... This is the story of how one species
Right. Now we
changed
start the
a
video.
planet.
Sorry to use that
The
time.
latest chapter of our story begins in England 250 years ago. Fueled by coal, then oil, several brilliant inventions appeared. They ignited the Industrial Revolution, which spread like wildfire through Europe, North America, Japan, then elsewhere. The great railways, then cars and highways, connected people across the globe. Medical discoveries saved millions of lives. New artificial fertilizers meant we could feed more people. Population rose rapidly. But this was nothing compared with what was to come. The 1950s marked the beginning of the Great Acceleration. Globalization, marketing, tourism, and huge investments helped fuel enormous growth. People swarmed to cities, which became even more powerful engines of creativity. In a single lifetime, the well-being of millions has improved beyond measure. Health, wealth, security, longevity, never have so many had so much. Yet 1 billion are malnourished. In a single lifetime, we have grown into a phenomenal global force. We move more sediment and rock annually than all natural processes, such as erosion and rivers. We manage 3/4 of all land outside the ice sheets. Greenhouse gas levels this high have not been seen for over 1 million years. Temperatures are increasing. We have made a hole in the ozone layer. We are losing biodiversity. Many of the world's deltas are sinking due to damming, mining, and other causes. Sea level is rising. Ocean acidification is a real threat. We are altering Earth's natural cycles. We have entered the Anthropocene, a new geological epoch dominated by humanity. This relentless pressure on our planet risks unprecedented destabilization. But our creativity, energy, and industry offer hope. We have shaped our past. We are shaping our present. We can shape our future. You and I are part of this story. We are the first generation to realize this new responsibility. As the population grows to 9 billion, we must find a safe operating space for humanity, for the sake of future generations. Welcome to the Anthropocene.
Okay. So, thanks very much for that. That video was shown at the opening of the Rio Plus 20 conference in 2012. And the video was developed by a global science program called Future Earth. And health workers, such as myself, are now starting to think about the future of health in the Anthropocene. Now that we are changing planetary systems, what does that mean for the way we should think about human health? So I'll just do another little time check here, because I do realise that I've used up quite a bit of time with that. But I hope it was a useful period of time in the talk. So important to remember what's happening with population. So here, population of the world, UN estimates in billions, and you can see from 1950 projected through to 2030. And the important bars on here, the purple bar shows the total population. The blue line is the number of people living in rural areas, and the red line, the number of people living in cities. And so here we are in 2015. where we have passed the point where now, for the first time in human history, more people now live in cities of the world, and for the foreseeable future, most population growth will be in cities. And currently, the cities of the world are growing by more than 1 million people every week. And when you do the math, that's 2 to 3 billion extra people by the middle of this century. So that's an important opportunity for the design professions in terms of how we shape those built environments. And it's important from a health point of view because how we shape those built environments will shape our future health. History is important, and just a couple of touch points in history. We've heard a bit earlier today about history in Hong Kong. If we draw the lens back a bit further, a foundation thinker in health, the Hippocratic Oath, of course, comes from Hippocrates in Greece in 400 BC, and he wrote about airs, waters and places all those years ago, well before we had all of the recent medical advances. So in many ways, these links between health and the environment are not a new thing. In some ways, we've actually lost a lot of this historical thinking, and I think that's also already been raised already in this meeting. Other examples, Roman cities, where there were very specific interventions in the interests of health. Public baths, aqueducts to bring water into the city, the drainage of marshlands to prevent mosquito-borne diseases. Here a slide from my colleague Tony McMichael showing the rise or fall of urban health penalties from the developed country experience. So along the horizontal axis there, we've got phases of development from the 1800s, industrialisation through modernisation to globalisation, and then some ideas for the future. And on that vertical axis, indicative health risks over time. Infectious diseases, many of them brought under control, but now confronted by other challenges. In many developed cities, air pollution was a huge problem through the 1900s, brought under control, but not yet under control here in Asia, as we've already heard. Road trauma in many countries coming under control with engineering and built environment modification, as well as behaviour change. But you can see on the right there that we've got new challenges ahead, the obesity epidemic on the rise, and importantly, greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, which will have feedback impacts on health, mostly negative. So clearly this is not sustainable. About 10 years ago now, we convened a conference, a transdisciplinary conference in Australia on the topic of urbanism, environment and health. So we were looking at the way we live in cities, what that means for our environment and what it means for health. We brought together researchers, policymakers, practitioners, not dissimilar to the group in the room, and we grappled with these challenges from an Australian policy point of view. Again, my colleague Tony McMichael, who I mentioned before, showed this slide at the beginning of that conference. And this is a busy slide, and I don't want you to read every word. It's a slide that looks at the links between urban transport systems and health. But just a bit of a guide through that to show that there's a lot going on here when we think about urban transport systems. They clearly, the transport system in a city like Hong Kong is partly inherited, but it's also evolved and planned, reflecting both the history, but also the urban planning values, preferences and theories. Once we have a transport system, it will have energy consequences. There's a mix of modes, there's associated infrastructure. And then there are flow-on consequences. What will the level of air pollution be? Greenhouse gas emissions, noise exposure, safety. Importantly also walkability. Can we move around safely in the city? And then there in red, some of the potential negative consequences from health when we have unsustainable and unhealthy transport systems, which, to be frank, is true of many cities of the world at the moment. One of the things that came from that conference was this organising framework for thinking about urban sustainability and population health. In some ways, this is a fairly simple grid, but it's an attempt to put the spectrum of issues on the table. So on the top axis, that horizontal axis, we have chunked what happens in cities into 6 broad categories: the economy and work, transport and urban form, housing and buildings, nature and landscape, media and communication, and cultural and spiritual dimensions. When a city's functioning, of course, it works more like a system and in aggregate has a footprint on our planet, the so-called ecological footprint. On the vertical axis there are what we in public health call determinants of health: the quality of the air, the water we're drinking, the noise, infection exposure, allergens, chemical exposures, local climatic conditions. There's many of them already touched on today, and other relevant things: food security, food access, what are we eating in cities, could we grow more food within cities, how active are we in cities daily, can we move up and down our buildings using the stairs, can we walk and cycle safely. Safety issues, often in motorcar dependent cities, the motor car is a critical safety issue. Importantly, also family relationships and social capital. We've touched on mental well-being already. But the purpose of this grid is the cells in the middle, where we haven't put words in this example, but it enables this grid to bring together design professionals, urban planners who are principally interested on the horizontal axis there at the top, with health folk such as myself interested in those determinants on the vertical axis on the right. And in those cells we can ask research questions, policy questions, planning questions, and wrestle with the need for trade-offs as we do so. And here's an example of an attempt to explore that in an Australian context, a checklist for healthy and sustainable communities that I developed a number of years ago with Ed Blakely, a leading urban planner who was based in Sydney at the time. This was really just to encourage a discussion and debate about the sorts of issues we're interested in. It's still freely available on the internet. And the ideas were picked up in this Copenhagen Agenda for Sustainable Cities, the 10 Principles for Sustainable City Governance that was promulgated at the time of the COP15 climate change conference in Denmark back in 2009, and in fact developed with the International Federation for Housing and Planning that some of you may have connections with. A few words about climate change and health. We've mentioned the Lancet already today, and influential medical journals can be useful in this context. So this was the final conclusion of a commission led by Anthony Costello from the University College London now 6 years ago. Climate change is the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. We've heard about heat this morning, but there's more to it. Again, from McMichael, the environmental epidemiologist, what are the pathways between climate change and human health? So here, a schema that I find useful to get my head around the range of challenges that we face in a changing climate. Climate change on the left, health impacts on the right. 3 broad categories, 1, 2 and 3. 1 being the direct ones: heat waves, fires, floods, storms, water shortages. These things damage health and people die from these events. That's relatively straightforward. Importantly, though, there's a range of indirect system-mediated impacts of climate change on health, and these can be further subcategorised into changes to physical systems and processes, such as air pollution with particular weather conditions, in particularly hot weather. Ground level ozone formation is at a faster rate and increases the risk to human health. In a city like Hong Kong, for example, that the difference in weather between days makes a difference to the health risk. biological changes, changes in processes and timing. For example, mosquito density. We're seeing rises in dengue fever in many cities of the world in the context of changing climatic conditions. Importantly, in many countries, the drying that we're experiencing, including in my country, Australia, in Western Australia near Perth, the climate has already changed. It is now a drier climate and is expected to be forevermore. And that is affecting crop yields, and that affects the incomes of farmers, and many farmers in Australia are getting depressed, and we have increasing suicide rates. So there's pathways here through those biological changes. And the final category there, under number 2, the changes to broader ecosystem structure and function. Changes to fisheries, constraints on microbes, changes to nutrient cycles. Importantly, though, that third category, the flow-on effects, are probably where we're going to see most of the health challenges. The so-called social determinants of health, if you like, the flow-on between those other things that are happening as a result of climate change and what that means for social systems, economic circumstances, and demographic disruption, including people needing to migrate as a consequence of climate change. Whether that's people living in small island states in the South Pacific or people, large populations living in deltas around Asia. So a lot going on there. Now, just some specific data from Australia on the summer heat wave, data from the Victorian Chief Health Officer. This was the major heat wave at the end of January in 2009. So you can see there on the horizontal axis at the bottom, the week beginning the 21st of January through to the 1st of February. And you can see the temperatures there, the dotted line rising from the 26th in the mid-20s, rising through into the mid-40s for a sustained period before dropping back. The blue horizontal line is the number of deaths we would have expected in the state of Victoria if it was an average year, if it was an average week within an average year, looking at the previous 5 years. So you can see that in a population that size, we would have expected about 90 or so deaths every day in Victoria. But what happened in the red line there, you can see that as the temperatures rose and stayed high, the daily death rate increased to more than 200 a day. And indeed, it stayed up there beyond, at around that level of 200, even once the temperature had dropped back there to 30 degrees. And that was because by that time, a lot of people were already too ill to survive, and they went on to die anyway. So you can see there there were hundreds of extra deaths in Victoria at that time, and these are considered unnecessary deaths brought forward by the heat wave. And this was in addition to the hundreds of deaths at the same time from incineration in the bushfires in Victoria. But these deaths that I'm showing you today on the chart, they didn't make the media because we only look at this data down the track. So climate change is already affecting our health. Now, that was Australia. If we look at a map of the world, this is a scaled map of the world, scaled by WHO regions, and looking at who's already dying from climate change. People dying from malnutrition, diarrhea, malaria, flooding. And it's been scaled by where the rates are highest around the world. And you can see that it's countries in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia who are really struggling the most already in terms of climate change health impacts. But if we look at another scaled cartogram of the world, who's responsible for those emissions that are causing climate change? And it's almost the polar opposite, isn't it? You can see that the United States is scaled up, the United Kingdom is scaled up, Europe, Japan is scaled up. And that's because those are the countries where there was major industrial revolutions. Now, over time, this map will continue to change, because clearly China is now in the middle of a major industrial revolution, and so things will continue to change. Countries like Australia and the Middle East, per capita consumption and greenhouse gas emission responsibility is propelling ever upward, seemingly at the same time. So it's a changing landscape, but there's no doubt that there is historical responsibility too. So equity in climate change, those least responsible will be most affected. And indeed, we risk worsening the disadvantages by the policies that we need to introduce to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So if we think about urban transport, we want to encourage people to not use their cars. So one thing we might do is put more taxes on fossil fuels for cars. But if there's no mass transit in the suburb where you live, and it's a long way from where you work or study, then you're just stuck with it because you haven't got an alternative. So we have to make sure that we're modifying the built environment at the same time as we're putting other taxes and other incentives in place. But I want also to highlight the positive story. And I'll need to start drawing the threads together, I realise as well, because I don't want to dominate this session too much. But there is a good news story here about health and climate change, and that's the idea of co-benefits for health from action on climate change. And there was a Lancet series on these positives a number of years ago, back in 2009. So transitions to sustainable ways of making energy, renewable energy generation is better for health, both locally, because people aren't affected by the toxic air pollution from coal-fired power stations if we're generating energy from solar and wind, for example. So the transition brings direct now health benefits, not just future health benefits. Transport and mobility, walking and cycling in cities, good for health now and next week, both physical and mental health, also less greenhouse gas emissions per trip. Food and diet, we've already heard about the health value of a vegetable-rich diet, and vegetables require less greenhouse gas emissions, less water to produce the energy needs for a vegetarian diet. Housing, well-designed, well-oriented buildings, better for health both inside the building, well-ventilated, natural ventilation where possible, and better in terms of an energy footprint. So low-carbon ways of living are healthy ways of living, provided we address the structural inequities that are already in place in our cities. Now, as I wrap things up, I wanted to mention some work by a very eminent human ecologist, Stephen Boyden. Indeed, Stephen did his seminal work here in Hong Kong in the 1970s under the UNESCO Man in the Biosphere program, and part of the work was done with the Chinese University of Hong Kong. We heard from the Vice-Chancellor just before. And the study that he did was called The Ecology of a City and Its People. And thus far, it's never been repeated, but it really does provide an extraordinary opportunity for Hong Kong to look at its progress over those decades. And one of the things that came from Stephen's important work was this elegant triangle, to understand that all human activities have potential for positive and negative impacts on our health directly, but also the potential for positive and negative impacts on planetary systems, such as the climate system, which will have flow-on impacts for health. And when he unpacked that, he explored these universal health needs of the human species. We tend to focus on the biophysical on the left. We've talked about quite a number of them already today, but the psychosocial on the right are at least as important. A few words about the post-2015 development agenda, which we're currently negotiating. This will be different to the current development agenda because it will integrate our focus on sustainable development with a focus on poverty reduction. And the essential difference is that all member states need to ultimately sign up to change. It's not just low-income countries that need to develop anymore. It's high-income countries that need to contract consumption so that we can converge outcomes for people all around the world. And this will bring health benefits, as I've said. In post-2015, we need to be seeing that health is both an input to development, so clearly we need health services to treat people when they get sick, but importantly, health is an outcome of development. So the sort of built environment we develop will shape our health in future. And so that means that health is relevant to all of the SDGs that are proposed, all 17 of them. And I won't go through them individually here. I encourage you to look at them if you haven't already. Systems thinking, I believe this is a valuable tool because it enables us to look at the dynamic interactions between the sectors that are at play in the environments where we live, to look at the important feedbacks as a consequence of the decisions we make. Why are we stuck? The idea of policy resistance. Where could we intervene? What are the leverage points? What might be the consequences that we're not planning for? And we use an approach at UN University called collaborative conceptual modelling to get people from different disciplines talking together and listening and understanding from different perspectives. 6 steps. What is the challenge? Looking at the history. What is the story? Can I see how you think? Can I understand the same problem from a different disciplinary perspective? What drives system behaviour? Where are the leverage points? And then can we see with new eyes as we reflect back? So a couple of system examples that are very relevant to today. If we think about unintended consequences, 200 years ago, health problems in industrialising cities in England led to the Garden Cities movement, moved people out of crowded inner cities to garden suburbs. But in the 21st century, we now face new health problems such as obesity in the context of urban sprawl. So that's an example that's very relevant to us today. Feedback, another system example. Climate change is increasing the intensity of heat waves, India, Pakistan in recent weeks, which is leading to increased demand for air conditioning in many cities, thereby increasing energy use and greenhouse gas emissions from climate control in homes and workplaces. So that's a feedback, a so-called positive feedback. I won't go through this. This is a system example. To go back to that urban transport example, I wanted to mention Dick Jackson's work. He leads on research for the Academy here. Their important work on making healthy places, designing and building for health, well-being and sustainability, looking at this in an integrated way. This slide, which is not projecting properly because of differences in compatibility between the systems, but this actually comes from the Academy, Healthy City Design. We put this together a number of years ago, and both Mark's going to speak next if there's any time left, and Roderick Lawrence who'll speak later. The International Council for Science has got a major new program on this, health and wellbeing in the changing urban environment using systems approaches, and the headquarters of that program is in Xiamen, about an hour flight away from here. Now, final words about coming back to the Anthropocene, where I started. The Lancet and Rockefeller Foundation in the last 18 months have convened a commission on planetary health, and this was an idea from Richard Horton, the editor of The Lancet. It was chaired by Andy Haynes from London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and it was about these ecological determinants of health and pointed directly at what needs to change in the post-2015 development agenda. The report of the Commission will be launched in about 8 hours' time, Safeguarding Human Health in the Anthropocene Epoch. It's going to be launched in New York at the Rockefeller Foundation headquarters at 9 a.m. New York time. And I've got an advanced copy here, and I think that this will ultimately transform the way we think about human health. So the key messages today: the post-2015 development agenda aims to integrate sustainable development and poverty eradication. Human health and well-being should be understood as an input to development and an outcome of development. Systems thinking and human ecological approaches can help us understand why we're stuck, the policy resistance, and it can help us identify the best interventions point. And this Lancet idea of planetary health as a new way of understanding health for this Anthropocene acknowledges the ecological as well as the economic and social foundations of health. And the final message is that as a transdisciplinary knowledge community, this academy is well placed to provide leadership in efforts to achieve these SDGs. Thanks very much.